What I will be basically focusing on today, and perhaps for the next couple of days, as a matter of fact, is on the radical differences between the two major groups of traditions that I spoke about. The Abrahamic tradition, including whatever goes in the name of Judaism, Christianity, Islam, and the Indian tradition, Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, Sikhism. And as I mentioned, of course, within these traditions, there are large differences, but that will take many lifetimes to really address all of them. So we are speaking on a very large scale. And clearly, all of us would agree that the truth or the real or God is hardly Hindu or Christian, but we are, whether we like it or not. Each one of us is conditioned by our cultural background. As I have simply mentioned, perhaps even more than once, in Canada, we have holidays at Christmas and Easter, not when the Buddha was enlightened. And then in the schools, there are all sorts of hymns being recited, and kids growing up in Canada, it doesn't matter whatever their background is. They may not be religious in any official sense of the word, but they are very much influenced by the cultural conditioning. So it is therefore important and helpful to know what other traditions think differently about these things. And in a global culture, it is helpful for us to understand, not to get stuck on one perspective or one tradition. So that is basically what I'll be focusing on, but there was one item which I, for some reason, forgot to mention, which is common to all the traditions. So let me just mention that before proceeding on the differences. And that is, it can be, of course, it can be expressed in many different ways, but one way of saying is that without God, it cannot be done. Without human beings, it will not be done. It often gets more or less mentioned as the grace and effort. And we had a very great sage in India, Shvetashvatar. In fact, one of the Upanishads is named after him. He makes this remark that all human realization is a combination of two Sanskrit words here, tapas prabhav and deva prasad, meaning effect of the human effort and the benediction of the devas. So every human realization depends on both of these factors. And it is interesting to remind you that there is, of course, particularly some theological perspective argument. Is it wholly dependent on our effort, or is it wholly dependent on the grace of God? So sometimes this argument goes on, and some of you may be interested in this. Martin Luther, who initiated the whole Protestant Revolution, was so persuaded internally that it doesn't matter what we do, we cannot persuade the Holy Spirit to do anything, that it wholly depends on the grace of the Holy Spirit. And therefore he said something which Lutherans never quote, but you can check it. Therefore sin bravely. And he made this remark before he married the Kate, nun. She was a nun, Kate. But ironically, he so much emphasized the importance of grace. But now if you look at the Protestants generally, at least sociologically, they seem to work much harder than the Catholics do. So it's quite ironic. It's completely contrary to his perspective on this, that everything depended on the grace of God. And this, of course, is realized even by the great scientists. I will give you an example from Einstein's remark. He was occasionally asked, they did not use the word grace, they would say chance. Is creativity a matter of chance, or is it a matter of hard work? And his remark is really quite interesting. He said, ultimately, it is a matter of chance, but chance seems to favor the prepared. So really what is required from our side is actually to acknowledge that, in fact, ultimately it does come from God or from the other side. But it's like, it used to be one of the, more or less sometimes almost an argument with Krishnamurti. He would say, the sun is shining. All you need to do is to open the window. The sun is, but some windows are painted shut. They need to be scraped. So until one is able to actually open the window, and the window is openable, the sun may keep shining. It's not going to come to me. So both are required. Chance is ultimately the source of creativity. This is Einstein's remark. But chance seems to favor the prepared. Now, coming back to the radical differences, really the main difference from which many things follow is, as I mentioned quickly the last time when we were closing the class here, that in the Indian tradition, we don't have a creation myth. What is there, I have never heard anybody make this particular label, but that's at least my understanding. There is an emanation myth. Brahma, which is said to be the label or the reference to the highest reality, Brahma did not create the world. The whole manifested universe emanated from the substance of Brahma. A classical example of this is in the oldest Upanishad, Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, where the example is given that a spider web oozes out of the substance of the spider. Then the spider can move anywhere on the web or even away from the web. So Brahma is not wholly confined to the manifested universe. Brahma can move away from the manifested universe or can move anywhere on it, in it. But everything in the manifested universe comes from the substance of Brahma. This is a very fundamental notion, whereas, and therefore, the manifested universe, of course, at different levels of consciousness, that is true, but it is almost like beginning from the highest level, and there is a continuous trend going down, right from the highest Deva, like an angel, but it's not exactly the same reference, from the highest Deva to even the stones, it is all permeated with Brahma. Whereas in the Abrahamic tradition, very strong emphasis of a very radical difference between each level of manifested universe. Even among the angels, there are 9 orders of angels in the Bible. An angel cannot just become an archangel, or even the highest angel, which was Lucifer, which literally means the light bearer. He was expelled from heaven because he wished to be like the Most High. This is Prophet Isaiah's remark that I just exactly quoted that. The reason why he was expelled was because he wished to be like the Most High. Although it's a reference more to his pride, that it was the pride that caused him to be expelled from heaven. But what I'm saying is that even the highest angel cannot come becoming like the Creator. No creature at any level can become like the Creator. And also, this radical difference between each level was one of the fundamental the argument against Darwin's theory of evolution, because human beings and animals are radically different from each other. And therefore, there is no, one cannot possibly admit, no Orthodox Christian would possibly admit that the animals developed to become human beings. This is background of the theory of evolution. So there are radical differences among each level. That's very central. And anybody in the whole tradition who ever claimed to be one with God or close to God was either crucified or killed or excommunicated. You all know the example of Christ himself. This is Gospel of John, 10th chapter, 30th verse, where he actually said, the Father and I are one. And the very next 2 or 3 verses then indicate how people pick up the stones to kill him, you a mere man, claiming to be one with God. And then similarly in the Islamic tradition, Al-Hallaj was more or less said something very similar to Christ's remark. And precisely because of that, they said that he should be killed exactly the same way. So he was also actually crucified for the same reason, for using similar expressions. And then Meister Eckhart, a mystic, had also come to, not exactly saying these words, but coming very close to that, the soul is as infinite as God, is one of his remarks. And he was excommunicated. So in the Jewish tradition, Christ is actually crucified. In the Christian tradition, Meister Eckhart, and in the Islamic tradition, Al-Hallaj. I'm just giving you a simple example that the whole Abrahamic tradition is very much against the idea that anybody, any creature, can possibly come close to God or become one with God. Whereas in the Indian tradition, there are 4 what are called Mahavakyas, the great enunciations. And the first one is, I am Brahma. And Aham Brahmasmi. I don't need to say this in Sanskrit, but just to say in English. The second one is, you are that. That is Tat Tvam Asi in Sanskrit. You are that. That meaning referring to, again, the same thing, Brahma. And then that our deepest soul or deepest self, Atma, is identically the same as Brahma. That is actually called the supreme identity in the Indian tradition. And then the fourth one is consciousness is Brahma, or integrated intelligence is Brahma, or wisdom is Brahma. The Sanskrit word is pragya. Hard to translate this by one English word, but maybe consciousness will do temporarily, is Brahma. So that is said to be one of the characteristics of Brahma. Now, just to take a few moments here to say, Brahma literally simply means vastness. But the English word vastness somehow doesn't seem to include time in it, generally. So sometimes, for example, Annie Besant translates Brahma as the eternal. She seems to be quite unique about this, actually, as far as I know. In general, it's not translated at all by anybody, but she translates this as the eternal, partly to also include time. But generally, it's just a standard Sanskrit word, meaning largeness or vastness or endlessness. Many ways could be said in English. It's difficult to quite convey by one word in English. And then, as I just mentioned, these are the 4 Mahavakyas, the great enunciations. But one of the consequences of this is that everything has Brahma in it. In fact, this idea continues later on in the Indian tradition. For example, in the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna says, if you're interested, this is in the 13th chapter, everything that exists is a combination of the field and the knower of the field, and I am the knower of the field in all fields. So in everything, Krishna exists. Otherwise, it won't exist. The very fact that it exists requires that an element of, in this case, he uses the word Krishna. Some other words get used, like Purusha and Prakriti, that nothing can actually exist in Prakriti without Purusha being involved in it. The very fact that it exists requires Purusha. And so that's another expression, or Brahma. Several different words get used. This particular thing is repeatedly emphasized by Krishna. One of his very famous shloka, 7th chapter, 19th shloka. That I would actually even say in Sanskrit, because it is personally in my life has been a very important shloka. Bahunam janmanam ante jnanavan mam prapadyate Vasudeva Sarvamiti Samahatma Sadurlabha. At the end of many births, a wise person comes to me realizing that all there is Krishna. Such a person is a great soul, but very rare. The reason I mention this, my father was a very busy and distinguished lawyer. He hardly ever had any free time, as far as I knew, as a kid growing up. But occasionally, whenever he would have some free time, he would sit in the sun, surrounded by lots of poetry books in different languages. Farsi, Urdu, English, Hindi, Punjabi, Sanskrit, etc. And somebody going by, if they happened to go by, he would recite it to them, but he was not trying to preach anything. On one occasion, I happened to go by, and he recited this particular shloka from the Bhagavad Gita. Now, I was 12 years old. From my point of view, it was like different level altogether. But then he spoke with great feeling, with almost tears in his eyes, saying, Ravi, I can translate this for you, but I don't really know what it actually means. And I hope that you will find a teacher or a teaching that will assist you to really realize that all there is Krishna. Now, this has actually stayed in my mind and in my heart forever, and it's almost really is the basis of all my search in my life. So the reason I thought I will mention this in Sanskrit is precisely because it almost brings tears in my eyes even now. But this great emphasis that all there is Krishna, all there is Brahma, is central to the whole of the Indian perspective. And therefore, of course, the call is to actually realize this. Anybody can say that. But the question is, does one actually realize this? And among our greatest sages, for example, ancient sages, it will be like Yajnavalkya, who you can read about in the oldest Upanishad, or contemporary ones, Raman Maharishi would say something like this. But this is very much the call. And in India, if somebody who actually can come to that level of quality of being, when they actually say this, they're hardly going to be crucified. Far from it. They're celebrated, they're exalted. Finally, they have actually come to really realizing what is meant to be the call of the spiritual teaching. So it is completely, radically different response to somebody saying, I am Brahma. But of course, it requires, any charlatan could say that. I could say that. That doesn't make it true. So therefore, it very much depends on the quality of the person who says that. Now, from whatever we can understand or can read from any material, love is oozing out of Christ. So it's not that the quality of this person doesn't correspond to something true, but it is not acceptable in the tradition. Therefore, he is going to be crucified for this. So this, in my judgment, is really the fundamental difference, and many things then follow from that. One is, it's actually even explicitly stated in several Upanishads, Ekam eva advitiyam is the way it gets. Oneness of everything, not the two. That follows from this notion very much. And therefore, as long as I remain an individual self, it is really a mark that I have not come to the real wisdom. So staying with one's individuality in the Indian tradition is a mark of ignorance. In the Abrahamic tradition, individuality is a mark of one's responsibility. I'm partly saying this so that it is silly to be either remaining with ignorance or becoming irresponsible. So one needs to realize that half the sages of the world did not get the matter wrong. How do we understand this? How do we bring these into some kind of global understanding? That's the reason I am actually emphasizing the differences, so that one could try to then see what comes from the other side. For example, in the Indian tradition, it is not very common, but it is certainly not unusual to say that somebody was exalted and that his spirit merged into the cosmic spirit. If any of you can show me an expression like this in the whole of the Abrahamic tradition, I'll happily give you a ticket to fly to Halifax. It is impossible to find an expression like this in the Abrahamic tradition. Whereas in the Indian tradition, this would be regarded as the mark of actually having exalted to something, that my spirit has merged into the cosmic spirit, not staying individually alone, separate. Whereas, for example, you can read this in the book of Exodus. God spoke to Moses as a man to a man. Even in the presence of God, Moses is separate, individual, being talked to. This would be considered completely odd in the Indian context. What kind of a God is this from their perspective? So I'm just trying to point out that you will see many, many differences resulting from this expression. And consequently, individuality is highly honored in the Western tradition. I say Western now because the Abrahamic traditions have been very much associated, especially through Christianity, very much associated with the Western world, and the other one gets called Eastern. Although these words are a little tricky, I think I mentioned the other day, one of the more important books in China is called Journey to the West. And in that book is the Journey to India. So the West-East is actually, it's a British designation started some time ago. It's from the British perspective, what is East and what is West. But these days, those labels are used, so. And also, one of the, it's the remark actually of Gurdjieff, every stick has two ends. This emphasis on individuality also becomes individualism, me. And you look at last several centuries, from Spain, from Portugal, from Germany, France, England, USA, all Christian countries dominating the entire world, militarily, financially, technically, every other way. And so the whole emphasis on individuality can become me. On the other hand, not to recognize the uniqueness of, you see, oneness can be, one needs to realize that oneness actually belongs in the realm of the origin, in the unmanifested universe. In the manifested universe, each particle of stone is unique. In fact, we had a Nobel Prize winner who was actually saying, this is silly to think we can have a human genome. There are more differences in each person from each other than there are atoms in the universe. There can never be a human genome. All medicine is statistical. There can't be just one genome for everybody applying. So there is an individuality, but that is then often in the Indian tradition is actually often forgotten, not realizing that each person is unique, and there is almost very much emphasis on something more or less transcreation in the other realm, from which we sometimes get very strange kind of expressions, such as Shankara saying, Brahma Satya, Jagat Matya. Only Brahma is true, the whole manifested universe is false. And at a sociological level, you can actually go to any Indian's home, they would keep it nice and clean, but they don't give a damn about what takes place in the neighborhood. Any of you who visited India would immediately agree with me. But this results partly precisely from not appreciating the uniqueness of each being, much more emphasis on something which is beyond uniqueness. So everything has two, as I said, every stick has two ends. Both good ideas, individuality is a mark of responsibility, but it also can lead to me, me, me. And freedom from individuality is freedom from selfishness, but it can also lead to just selfishness only for me, me, not for the others, not taking care of the others. So everything has its consequences. Which is why I personally have been very much struck by actually a remark of my own teacher, Jeanne de Salzmann. She said, true individuality consists of voluntarily placing oneself under a law. Let me repeat this. True individuality consists of voluntarily placing oneself under a law. Classic example of this is actually Christ at the eve of his crucifixion. In the Garden of Gethsemane, obviously he's not eager to die, eager to be crucified. So what does he say? If it is possible, let this cup pass me by. Yet not my will, but thine be done. So here is true individuality. Voluntarily submitting oneself to a law. Similarly, you see, for example, the examples of the Buddha, really any of the great sages. It's not that they get rid of their individuality, which is why I often say that on the one hand, it is true that Krishna says, all there is Krishna, but even Krishna could not replace a single child. So one needs to really understand more and more, how do we take expressions from these two great traditions and to see what is actually both the practical consequences of these, and then how does one not reconcile them simply just theoretically, but in one's life. How does one come to true individuality will be one way of saying it, but also to see that oneness with the other. And that you can now see with all the great sages. For example, both Christ and the Buddha loved all their disciples, but each one of them has a beloved disciple. Why? Because they are unique. So to say that they equally loved everybody sounds very nice, but that is hardly the case, because each one of them actually is said to have a beloved disciple. So the sun may be shining equally everywhere, as Krishnamurti often emphasized, but each one is completely uniquely in some room or the other, and one needs to find a way of connecting with the sunshine. It is not so just randomly, just because the sun is shining everywhere. So I invite you to consider these matters, and I will follow some of the other differences that come from this teaching here. Then another very major difference in the biblical tradition, God in one way or the other is personal. Whereas Brahma is not personal, cannot be expressed in the form of any person. A classic example of that is Michelangelo's painting in the Sistine Chapel. But by personal here, I mean the way it is understood, that God is almost as if he's got a large computer and keeping track of what everybody is doing, and then after death, he will appropriately reward them or punish them depending on what they have been doing. This kind of notion. And the reason I'm saying this, I would like to give you examples from within the Abrahamic tradition, one from a great philosopher, Spinoza, perhaps the greatest philosopher in the Jewish tradition, he very much disagreed with this whole idea that God is personal. He was much closer to sort of saying something, I don't want to necessarily equate it, but something which is behind the personal manifestation, the spiritual element which cannot be personified. And he was expelled, excommunicated, all his books were burnt. He was probably has been the most important philosopher in the whole Jewish tradition. And Einstein very much wanted to follow his perspective of God. And then in 1941, at a convocation address at the Columbia University, Einstein actually makes this remark that I hope that the religious leaders will have enough courage to get rid of the idea of personal God. And many Protestant ministers and several Jewish rabbis launched a public campaign to send him back to Germany. This is during the Second World War, 1941. Now, here is first of all a philosopher, then a scientist, then Meister Eckhart, might say a mystic. He decided to use two different words. In Latin, Deus, D-E-U-S, and Deitas, D-E-I-T-A-S, which will be something like God and Godhead. God will be then more or less corresponding to what in the Indian tradition we have, that in the manifested world there is the Trinity of gods, Brahma, Vishnu, Shiva. But Brahma, people occasionally get mixed up in these two words. Brahma is quite different from Brahma. Brahma is beyond manifestation, but also in manifestation. So Deitas is like Brahma, and Deus is like God, or like Brahma, Vishnu, Shiva, if you like, the Trinity of gods. Or there will be equivalent Trinity in the Christian tradition, God, Holy Spirit, and the Son. And he was excommunicated for coming up with these kinds of ideas. So we have examples from a philosopher, from a scientist, from a religious person, that for them to come up with this kind of notion that God is not personal is not acceptable in the whole of the Abrahamic tradition. Whereas this is a standard idea in the Indian tradition. And therefore, very strong notion that what actually therefore follows from it is, maybe we need to look at examples of this. In the religious insights, in the Abrahamic tradition, the initiative is taken by God. God speaks to one prophet or the other. You look at Abraham, Moses, Muhammad, or God sent, as the Gospel of John says, he so loved the world, he gave his only begotten Son. So the initiative is from God. Whereas in the Indian tradition, the initiative for the spiritual enterprise is from human beings. The Buddha sees a sick man, an old man, and a dead man, and he takes it internally, existentially, that he too will die, or his son will die. Then he wonders if there is anything that does not die. So he undertakes a search, and then he comes to some truth. But there is never any mention of Christ undertaking any search. We don't know anything about him from the age of 12 to 30, which is the time when anybody would be undertaking any search. But if any of you know in any Christian teaching, any mention that he went there or he was searching this or that, I will be surprised. You people are scholars of Christianity. You should instruct me. There is no mention that Christ was searching for anything or that Moses was searching for anything. or Abraham was searching for anything. Initiative is from God, who, as it were, takes the prophet. Prophet, by the way, literally means instrument in Greek. That's the literal meaning of the word prophet, instrument. So they are instruments of God. So God takes them by the scruff of the neck, and they have no choice. They have to do what they are instructed to do. And whereas you look at Vivekananda, look at Raman Maharishi, or look at especially the Buddha, even more so, search begins from their own realization that something is not clear, that something will die, and does anything survive or does not. And then they may come to something or may not come to something. We, of course, recognize those great sages who come to something. Otherwise, I wouldn't even be knowing the names of these people. Why would we know the name of the Buddha or of Ramana or Vivekananda if they had not come to anything? So, but the search begins from the human side. In my personal judgment, by the way, some of you know, in the Western tradition, God is always called He. And some feminist theologians are rather upset about this. Why? Why He? My impression is precisely no theologian ever clarifies any of this. Theologians are into something else, whether Peter was left-handed or right-handed. This is the kind of argument they're about. and I'll give you an example of it in a moment. My impression is traditionally, because of very ordinary language everywhere, activity was related with males and receptivity with females. Just really more or less to do with the genitalia. And therefore, because God is the active initiator in the Abrahamic tradition, my impression is this is the reason why he's called He. Although, as I said, I have never seen anybody trying to clarify this. Why is God called He? But the fact, nevertheless, is that you look at whatever stories we have about any of the prophets, none of them seem to be, at least it is not mentioned that they were searching for something or they were looking for something. For example, Moses, you all know, he was running away from the law, having killed an Egyptian soldier, and he meets a farmer, falls in love with his daughter, quite understandably. And then at one time in the field, he sees a bush which is burning. And then he hears a sound. Go tell the Pharaoh to let my people go. This is all in the book, Exodus. I'm not making it up. And so he's obviously, if he goes to the Pharaoh, he'll be imprisoned or even killed because, as I said, he's actually running away from the law. So he asks, who should I say has sent me? This is the first time the word Yahweh is actually used in the Bible. First time. This is Exodus 3:14, if you're interested in looking at it. And there, then he hears this sound. Go tell the Pharaoh that I am has sent me. So Yahweh is really translated as I am. In Greek, ego eimi. I partly mention this just to remind you, a little bit of a footnote. In English, we have the word Jesus. The root of that word is Joshua, coming from Yehoshua, meaning Yahweh saves. So these remarks of Christ, such as I am the way, the truth, and the life, literally should be translated as I am is the way, the truth, and the life. Referring to Yahweh is the way, the truth. I hardly ever see any of the Christian theologians, although there are exceptions to this. Only one reference I have given in my book, The Yoga of the Christ, is a reference to one of these Christian theologians who actually says exactly what I just said. Those translations miss. Christ has so completely emptied himself of himself. It's almost like adding ego to him, as if he's claiming to be the savior. This is completely strange because he repeatedly says, I say nothing of my own. I say what my Father in heaven tells me to say. You can read this at least 3 times in John's Gospel. But Christians are so dedicated to attributing all this to him, he repeatedly says he's completely trying to be free of himself, and that the expression really, even his name simply means Yahweh saves. That's the meaning of his name. And this will just go on. Every tradition has its own standard rigmarole. They just get caught in those things. I could give you similar examples from India, of course. This is not only in the Christian tradition. In any case, coming back to the point to be made, I'm not sure of this, but my impression is that the reason God is called He is because of the activity associated with it. The initiative is coming from God. And whereas very strong emphasis in the Indian tradition, even these 3 gods that I mentioned, the Trinity, Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva, their active energy actually is from the female counterparts of them. For example, Brahma creates the world with the help of Saraswati. This is the female counterpart of Brahma. And Vishnu maintains the order in the world with the help of Lakshmi. This is the female counterpart of Lakshmi. And Shiva engages in the, basically, I'll come to this in a moment, transformation of the world. Sadly, at some stage, somebody said, Brahma is the creator, Vishnu is the preserver, and Shiva is the destroyer, which is completely crazy expression. And then people keep repeating it. This is what scholars always do. Repeat and argue with each other and then further argument. Shiva is Lord of yoga, Lord of theater, Lord of music, Lord of grammar. Is this all destruction? It's absolutely crazy to call him God of destruction. He's God of transformation, never satisfied the way it is. Of course, transformation sometimes does require destroying something which you're stuck to. So in that sense, it is true, just like a farmer in the fall would clear the grounds in a way so that something new can grow next time. But he is not a destroyer in any sense of the word. It's a transformer, not ever satisfied the way it is. Whereas Vishnu is the preserver, trying to maintain the way it is. And it is very typically Indian attitude. A great old spiritual text says, at the heart of Vishnu resides Shiva, at the heart of Shiva resides Vishnu. So one doesn't need to be against one thing or the other, but to see how to bring the two of them together. If any society or a human being always remains at the same level, nothing will ever develop. But if they are constantly changing, nothing will seriously develop. So both are required, preservation and transformation. In any case, so let me come back to this, having some of the other differences that follow from this. This is also the reason why practically the whole of the Western tradition or the Abrahamic tradition is essentially prophetic in nature, whereas the whole of the Indian tradition is mystical in nature. And here I'll give you another personal example. This is 1963. I was actually doing my PhD in physics at that time at the University of Toronto. But having had some interest in what takes place, especially being in Canada, I wanted to learn something about it. Because every culture it was obvious to me that every culture is very largely influenced by its main religion. So I wanted to learn something about Christianity. My fellow graduate students who were all in physics department, they thought I was completely crazy. Religion, what religion is going to do anything with truth, as far as they were concerned. So I would try to go to a church or something every Sunday. They thought I was just nuts, except on one occasion I heard one of them say to the other, whispering, well, he's from India. That freed me to be engaged in any craziness because I was from India. That was a great freedom for me. But in any case, there was an organization called Student Christian Movement, who were at one stage wanting to have about 5 or 6 main talks on different aspects of religion. And you may be surprised, especially I'm asking people who are familiar with the religious literature here. Until almost 1970, it was practically impossible, even in biblical stores, to find a book on Christian mysticism. But after 1970, you could suddenly find many books on Christian mysticism. And this was in 1963 that I'm talking about. And so several very distinguished people spoke there. Marshall McLuhan gave a talk there, and Northrop Frye spoke. Falkenhayn, a great Jewish scholar, he gave a talk. But nobody wanted to speak about mysticism. So here, a graduate student in physics, I gave a talk on mysticism in 1963. And then I wanted to find out, get some material about this. And I talked to one Protestant minister, and this is, I'm quoting him directly. He says, mysticism has nothing to do with Christianity. It's a Catholic heresy. Can you believe this is, take my word for it. This is, but after 1970, approximately, it probably varies a little bit. Actually, some of this largely started in California, as a matter of fact. But there was a fairly famous book by Harvey Cox called Turning East. That's the title of the book. And because some of you know, this is the time when LSD was being used, and many people were going to India, some of them for religious purposes, but some to get some extra drugs. All kinds of things happen constantly. And so because of turning east, then the emphasis on mysticism became more and more. And of course, there are great mystics in the Christian tradition and the Islamic tradition. For example, who could be against Rumi or Hafiz or any of these characters, or Eckhart or John of the Cross. So there is no shortage of this, but they were not being emphasized very much earlier. But after 1970, especially in the biblical stores, you could actually get books on mysticism. So these are some of the differences that follow the traditions, or the organizers of the religions just try to emphasize one thing or the other based on. And there are many other differences. For example, I will probably develop some of this another day. In the Abrahamic tradition, every religion is organized around either a person or a historical event. Historical person, maybe even mythologized, but it's meant to be historical nevertheless. Historical person or historical event. This would be completely strange from the perspective of so-called Hinduism. There is no shortage of historically important persons who are honored, respected. But maybe some of you were here when I mentioned the word Hinduism or Hindu is not an Indian word. If you were not here at that time, maybe I'll take quickly to just mention this again. There is a river called Sindhu in Sanskrit, which was the dividing river between the Persian Empire and the Indian kingdoms. And the Persians in general, you can even talk to any of the Iranian friends now, they pronounce sa as ha. So they pronounce Sindhu as Hindu. And the other side is Hindustan, literally just like Pakistan. Stan basically, it actually related with the Sanskrit word stan, place, territory. So Hindustan is the place where the Hindus live. That's the other side of the river. And then when the word Hindu was written in Greek, which is how it came to the Western world, H is not pronounced. So it becomes Indus River. So we have a river Indus from which we then get the word India. So the word India or Hindu are not Indian words, let me remind you again and again here. Neither one of them. And then because the British were rather eager, quite understandably really from the empire side, to have religions fighting with each other when they were ruling India. In 1881, they had the first official census in India. And they wanted everybody to tell their religion also on the census. They did not know how to define a Hindu. So they gave a definition. A Hindu is an Indian who is not a Christian or a Muslim. That's the definition of a Hindu even now in the Indian Constitution. Take my word, because the Indian Constitution just adopted everything from the British side. And not that recently, but 15 years ago, actually, these days, there is even a whole conflict going on these very days in India. That's particularly some of the Sikhs and some of the Jains want to sort of separate themselves from the being called Hindus. But that would require 2/3 majority from the elected parliamentarians, which is not going to be easy done, to change the constitution. So according to the Constitution of India, a Hindu is an Indian who is not a Christian nor a Muslim. So Ananya is not a Hindu. She's of American origin. Guru is not a Hindu. I'm not a Hindu. So you see, because by definition we are not Hindus, legally. So, but the point I'm really more trying to make here is that these Abrahamic religions are all organized around a historical, at least according to them, a historical event. Sometimes scholars argue about this, whether it is mythological or historical. Did Christ actually ever existed, etc. So there are arguments which will go on. This is how scholars keep their jobs, so don't be against that. They have to keep arguing. And Hinduism, now I'm still using the word because that is actually within its own religious tradition, is called Sanatana Dharma, eternal law. It's not based on any particular person or a particular historical event. It is wishing to be or assuming to be related on eternal law. Which is why when I said the other day, it's the most disorganized religion in the world. If you want to ask something about Buddhism, you might ask the Dalai Lama. Or if you want to ask about Christianity, you might ask the Pope. Who would you ask if you want to ask something about Hinduism? There is no person. He'll ask me. No, because they're not an organization of this kind here. No? It's completely disorganized. But the expression for it within itself is Sanatana Dharma, meaning eternal law, trying to, therefore, in fact, traditionally, as you probably know, sometimes, for example, Vivekananda or Raman, occasionally they were great sages in India, and they were occasionally asked by people, how can I become a Hindu? Hinduism has never had a converting policy about this. And their response in general was, well, if you are of a Christian background or a Muslim background, really try to follow that teaching so that you can come closer and closer to God. Then you become a Hindu because you come closer to the law. That has been their general response, not trying to convert people. Conversion was considered a strange notion in India. It's a little like you're on the surface of the great sphere, you move from one point to the other point, but you still remain on the surface. The idea is to go to the center. The call is to go to, but the center can be, you can go to it through your own religion if you actually practice it. So they were never suggesting to people to convert to Hinduism. And now, of course, because they are trying to reconvert people, after many people in India got converted to Islam or to Christianity, so now this whole organization is being set up, actually. This is creating its own political problems. But this is also the reason why actually a very great scholar who has written many things on Buddhism said to me in one conversation, Buddhism is Hinduism for export. Because if you wish to take the Hindu notions outside India, then technically you are not a Hindu. But you can be a Buddhist carrying the same ideas outside. So Buddhism is Hinduism for export. But it is true, I also should mention, after Buddhism went to China, which was nearly 2,000 years ago, partly because of the whole practice coming not only from Confucius' side, but also the other spiritual teachings in China, the notions gradually begin to be a little bit changed. So Chinese Buddhism has a slight difference actually from Indian Buddhism. And later on, it moved from there to Korea to Japan. So slight changes take place because China is, after all, is not a stand night by culture like India. It's ancient cultures have strong influence. Whereas when India or Buddhism went to Thailand or Sri Lanka, those cultures are small. So they did not make much change in this. But China introduced a great deal of change because of its own great tradition coming from centuries back. But this might also interest some of you. The word that is, in Sanskrit there is a word called dhyan, which is translated as meditation. When Buddhism went to China, it was not translated, but just simply pronounced in a Chinese way as Chan. From there, it went to Korea, where it was pronounced as Son. From there, it went to Japan, where it was pronounced as Zen. So Zen is the Japanese pronunciation of the Korean pronunciation of the Chinese pronunciation of Sanskrit word dhyan, simply meaning meditation, which is the main emphasis in the Zen practice in general. So Zen simply means meditation. It's coming from that whole. So these kinds of movements have continued for centuries and will continue. But the reason I'm emphasizing some of these things, I will continue with some more of these, you will see. There are many other differences, largely arising from the very fundamental difference that I mentioned. But then there are some which are little different, like whether the initiative is from God or from human beings for the research. There are differences. They are not all completely associated with the notion of Brahma being the emanator from which everything comes. But that's the main difference. Okay.
Robin, are you saying initiated or initiative? Are you saying initiated?
Oh, sorry.
ED? When you just use the word initiate.
No, God sort of initiated the spiritual part in the Abrahamic tradition. And let's just take a minute before we stop and have some tea or coffee. Thank you very much. And I hope you don't all just simply accept what I'm saying. Bring your own insights and questions. And these are very large traditions. Let me also, actually, something I should have said. My impression is that in each of these major categories, you can find almost everything that exists on the other category. Somewhere, hidden here, there. Often people get persecuted even for having that, but it all exists everywhere. Because human beings have everywhere been searching. But what I am speaking about, the way the traditions get expressed. mostly by the theologians and the philosophers. This is not how the great searchers themselves actually experience any of this. I will come to that. Okay, so please bring, questions are also okay, but really bring your own insights or different perspective, or examples of something that I said is not right, or perhaps to emphasize it more that it is right. So either is okay. Yes.
When you were saying about Christ and Christianity, that there's nothing, if anyone knows of anything where he searched for answers or whatever, I always thought, it was years ago when I studied theology, but I always took it that when he was 12 and went to the temple, he went to learn. He wanted to learn. Of course, he ended up teaching them, but the evidence was there. And his years in the wilderness, that traveling out when he was tempted, he was seeking inwardly for answers. I always thought I could be wrong.
No, I think it is absolutely clear. No human being could possibly be not searching for something or the other. Even if it is just, how can I get a better job? It could be even at that level. But what I'm saying is that in the Bible or in the Christian tradition, as far as I know, maybe there are exceptions, people should tell me. It is not mentioned that Christ went somewhere searching for something, or he went to a monastery, or he went to a mountain, or he sat in meditation, or he prayed, or whatever.
Well, he went to the wilderness and he went to the temple. Those are two examples.
No, but in that particular temple, he's already getting into trouble with the people there.
Yes, but he went there to seek answer. That was my thought.
Yeah. Okay. Yes.
Could you ask Letitia?
Who?
Letitia.
Please, Letitia, speak up.
Hello. Good morning. I was wondering, in the Western traditions where there's this distinct differences between different levels, it's striking to me that perhaps this has a lot to do with the ancient Greek traditions where, or even in the Bible, where one cannot aspire to the level of divinity because that is hubris. And if you do that, you will probably, have a very unpleasant result. But even in, I was trying to remember where I read something like this. There's the idea of human beings only having particular things that they can do or can wish for. And in Ecclesiastes, it says, "Therefore I perceive that there's nothing better, than that a man should rejoice in his own works, for that is his portion." So it's that human beings have a particular place, particular portion, and if they go beyond that, they maybe nemesis in the Greek tradition will catch up with them, and it will be very unpleasant. And so I wonder if that's where this individuality and separation of levels comes from.
No, I'm not sure that I really quite understood what she said. Somebody can put this in slightly different words or clarify something?
She said, "Rejoice in your works," it says in Ecclesiastes. She says, "Is that where this individuality comes from?"
Oh, I see.
That's what I think.
No, I was really talking about the Greek tradition, and also something that seems to come out also in Ecclesiastes, that human beings cannot achieve divine levels. They're restricted to a particular area, and if they try to go beyond that area, they will commit hubris in Greek tradition, which means that they will be visited by severe consequences. there are many legends, in Greek mythology, where people do this and terrible things happen to them. So I'm wondering if the Western tradition does stem in part from, something in the Greek, something in the Mediterranean that was like this. It's striking to me because I recently, not so recently, a couple of years ago, took some great book seminars and I read Herodotus. And it's just, in Herodotus, it's really amazing. And the people, there's also the tradition of the going to an oracle, and whatever the oracle says is going to come true, even if you don't understand it. It's really fascinating. And I wonder if there's any connection. To me, in Christianity, it's really clear that there's the idea that you can become immortal. People will rise from the dead. And that is hubris, really, in the old, in the Greek tradition.
Yeah, I think one of the things which needs perhaps to be emphasized, whatever we now mean by the Western world, there have been two sometimes quite independent sources of influences. One is actually coming from the Greek side, which ultimately results more and more in sciences and technology. The other is coming from the Jewish Christian religious side. So there are these two major influences. What I have largely been speaking about here is just the religious side of it. But there is, of course, in fact, one of the things I feel more so really in USA than almost anywhere else, there is very much an emphasis on exploration, searching. And I was completely surprised to read somewhere, maybe this is not correct information from the internet, that on the average, every American moves their home once in 3 years. I can't imagine a larger movement once in 3 years on the average. So I think there is a very strong urge for more exploration, more search. And on the other hand, there is a lot of emphasis actually in the Indian tradition. You can especially see this in the Bhagavad Gita. Its suggestion really is of what the Sanskrit word is nashkarmya, actionlessness. But the emphasis more there is that the action need not be my action, but can I become an instrument of the divine will? But at an ordinary level, it can also mean just sit down, don't do anything. Whereas in the Western world, and especially in the USA, if anybody is sitting down even for a few moments, they say, what the hell are you doing there? Come, do something. It's a different attitude, very different attitude. So therefore it leads to more exploration, that is true. And the other side can lead to more, you see, to be free of, in a way even Krishnamurti makes this remark, strange remark it may sound, effort is an abomination. This is a direct quote from Krishnamurti. Now, does this therefore mean doing nothing? Or is it a call to some different kind of effort? So one can, of course, understand any of these things at different levels. But in general, it is true that there is much more emphasis on doing something or exploring something in the Western world than in India. Yes?
I've been wrestling so much this past year with the Heart Sutra specifically. In my Western or Abrahamic upbringing, that's been to me about breaking these binaries, self and others, increasing values, decreasing, just all of the different ways that we prioritize the individual. And what's so attractive to me about the Heart Sutra is this practice of interbeing, this order of inner being. But the translations vary so greatly. And one interpretation of it, about no thing being separate from any other, versus all things being separate of a separate existence. I'm really curious what your specific relationship to the Heart Sutra is now, or what your literal translation of it is now in English.
I have not translated the Heart Sutras, but really every translation is a transcreation. Very much depends on the attitude of the translator and, of course, his or her background knowledge, what their intentions are, etc. But this is not a problem only from Indian languages to English. It's equally the other way around. As a simple example, if you look at a large Oxford English dictionary, under the word soul, you will see at least 10 pages. Why? Because every great sage in the Western world has a slight different understanding of what soul is. And also every writer, great writer, say Shakespeare uses English, but he also changes English. Same thing is true in India. So in a way, for example, the word, we have a Sanskrit word Atma, can be translated as spirit, as soul, as self. So depending on the context, the translator will choose one of these. And then there is another slightly difficult, well, not difficult, but it's really a kind of an academic emphasis that you should be consistent in your translation. Now, consistency can be helpful, but it can also be a problem because if each time one translates Atma as self and never as spirit or soul, that can be problematic. And I had exactly the same criticism of, I used many years ago, 1990 it was published, I wrote a book on John's Gospel called The Yoga of the Christ. Using the word yoga yoga has many different meanings, but it can also mean the way, the path, the teaching of Christ, basically. And later on, for one reason or the other in USA, they did not want to use the word yoga and Christ in the same title. So they translated this, published this as the Gospel of John according to Indian mysticism. Then it sounds very academic, which is not what I was trying to do. But consequently, the American Theological Association had a special session on this book in one of their conferences. And they asked two theologians to make commentary on it, or criticism would be the right word, and then asked me to respond to this. And one of the criticisms was exactly that in different chapters, I end up using different translations. Now, from my point of view, if one translation makes more sense in one context, why not to use it in that context? But there's always issues. And then another criticism was that I was mixing the water of Ganga with the water of Jordan. So when my turn came to respond, first of all, I try to point out, of course, if you're going by a bullock cart by the river Ganga or by a camel by the river Jordan, you have a different perspective. But if you fly from India going right over Ganga as well as Jordan, then you have a different perspective. But I should say here something. I read to them a letter written to me by Wilford Cantwell Smith, who was the founding director for the Center for the Study of World Religions at Harvard University, not a minor academic type. And in this letter, he said, as I read your book several times, I had to wipe tears from my eyes. How can a person not brought up in the Christian tradition get so deep understanding of this, whereas all the Christians are missing out? So I read this aloud, and there was stunned silence because I said, how come your own children or grandchildren would much rather go listen to the Dalai Lama than go to the church? What are you people actually doing, all these theologians? But one really needs to see what is happening in the tradition. Search is really the central requirement for any human being. This has now been almost wholly associated with science, where we do scientific research. And as if everywhere else you just accept what has been said in the Bible or in the Gita or whatever, it just becomes a kind of a strange kind of submission, not a search for something. So when you're raising this question, maybe what I recommend, I have myself tried to translate the Yoga Sutras, not the Heart Sutra, but the Yoga Sutra, as well as the Bhagavad Gita. But at the end, I give at least 20 or 25 key words in Sanskrit to give their as much meaning as I can, so that it is a good idea to, even if you see the word is being translated as self, but if it is Atma is being translated, come back to the original word for it, because each word has its own richness. This is true in every language. It's not only in Sanskrit to English problem, it's also English to Sanskrit problem. Don't dismiss the richness of English. Also, it also has its richness. And therefore, to stay with the original, at least 20 or so keywords is very helpful. So if you're studying the Heart Sutra, that's my recommendation to you, to find some of the keywords in it and try to wrestle with them. Otherwise, every translation is a transcreation, I can assure you. Very simple example, there is one word often in the Yoga Sutras which is said to be one of the obstacles, called abhinivesh in Sanskrit. It simply really means inertia, staying with the status quo. But then occasionally somebody, like Taimani is a good example of this, translate this as wishing to continue living. They must have a bad life or something. What is the harm with wishing to continue living? It's just simply addiction to the status quo. If I am alive, I want to keep living. If I have a particular job, I want to keep the same kind of job. That is really very much the notion of inertia behind it. But that's my understanding, which because the word abhinivesh itself has two words in it, so there is many Sanskrit roots involved in it. So the fact is, one can't be wholly convinced that this is the only meaning of this word. Depends on the context, and some other writers may have used it slightly differently. So my recommendation is to, if you're serious about it, take at least more than one or two translations. But more importantly, come back to the key words in the original language.
It occurs to me that something that I learned early on in working in the theosophical work, which was interesting, is that the effort, no matter what spiritual texts we're called, and perhaps even to what translation speaks to us the most, something happens in the energy of those texts that works on the mind in a different way. Madame Blavatsky said that it actually changes what she called the little brain lives. And it seems true for me. I can feel how pondering these things for so many years has actually changed. It has changed the quality of my attention. It has increased my interest and devotion to a certain way of approaching these texts. So the effort that we're putting in is changing us from within in quiet ways that I think science is now beginning to take some interest in the changes in the psyche. So that it's studying exactly as you have suggested, working with the content, and then also applying a certain energy, a certain attention, even a quality of reverence to what we're reading that has it's not even, it's like a catalyst. The whole of our nature is changing with the effort we're putting in.
I think it is absolutely true that even the language one uses more frequently, the way you recite something or say something very much affects where it is coming from and how the rest of the body is affected by this. Our breathing, in fact, I occasionally recommend to people, you can watch carefully. If somebody has just annoyed you for whatever reason, saying something or doing something, watch the change that takes place in your breathing. Any emotion of any kind affects our breathing, and then the moment I become aware of this and can in fact just pay attention to my breathing, it will change my emotion. In fact, I am completely convinced that all our emotional tensions are one form or the other of self-assertion. They're coming from our own getting stuck on something or annoyed with something. More and more carefully. In fact, a long time ago, it had gotten me into some trouble with Mary Zimbalist, actually, but I had raised a question with, maybe I give a slight background to this just for a minute. I was coming from a conference in Hawaii, going to Halifax, not next door. I had to change overnight flights from Los Angeles. And Krishnamurti had said to me, anytime you are near, please come and see me. In fact, on one occasion he said, well, let the Krotona people pay for your travel and then you sneak out and come and see me. This is his expression. So I called Mary Zimbalist if Krishnamurti was here. I wasn't sure whether he was in Ojai. And she said, he's here and I'm sure he'll be happy to see you, but he's very tired right now. He's been just speaking, giving 3 or 4 public talks every day for the last 3 or 4 days, and he's exhausted. So I was feeling a little sad that I should not go. So she was not sure that I should come. But then she said, come, but promise that you won't raise anything serious. You may have been there when all this took place. I don't know. I mean, asking Mark and Asha here. But in any case, so I promised. So we are sitting, first of all, at lunchtime. He was not eating very much at that. He was about 85 years old then, 1988. As far as I know, he was not eating very much. At lunchtime, I was sitting on his left side, Mary Zimbalist on his right side, and my wife was sitting opposite him, and there were 1 or 2 other people. Throughout lunch, he kept holding my right hand. Now, I'm not accustomed to eating with my left hand, especially coming from India. So I had to have my lunch with my left hand. And both Mary and I would occasionally say, well, Krishna, it's such a nice day. You know, we were just trying to be superficial intentionally so we don't raise anything serious. Then I don't know suddenly what happened from me. The reason I'm mentioning this is what I was just about to say here. I said, Krishnaji, it seems to me that every impression leaves a change in our body at a molecular level. And that a new body is required for a new consciousness. I have no idea from where this came. I mean, I was trying to just talk about the nice sun is shining kind of thing. So he turns to me, shall we go into this? And Mary Zimbalist looks at me with dragon eyes, because obviously I had betrayed my promise. So I even tried to say, well, Krishna, maybe we'll speak about it later on after some rest. And I have personally actually never heard him becoming so angry. I thought as a great sage, he shouldn't be that angry. He actually said to Mary, shut up. You don't know what you're speaking about, etc. So he sent somebody to get a tape recorder to record this. But in any case, then we had a little conversation, and after a little while, I felt really so bad about it. So in fact, I left Ojai, had to rent a hotel room in Los Angeles, because my flight was next day. 3 days later, the phone rings at our place. And my wife answered the phone. She says, the voice sounds familiar, but very formal. May I speak to Professor Ravindra? Nobody calls me that, Professor Ravindra. And it was Krishnamurti on the phone. I have no idea how he got my phone number. Why wouldn't he ask somebody else to call me and then give him the phone? I have absolutely no idea. Then he says, what you had said 3 days ago, I have been thinking about it. Can you come and see me for half an hour? I'm 4,000 miles away. But the reason I'm telling you all this is simply because this is actually a very important idea, that every impression affects our body at a molecular level. And becoming more and more aware of this, imagine what is taking place. You go in a supermarket, what kind of impressions are being created by it, or on the television. This is thoroughly degenerating the whole culture. But that is the tragedy. So in a way, the point you're making is very directly related with this. Whatever we hear, however we respond, however we breathe, all of this is affecting our whole bodily change here, especially breathing. Breathing is, well, I hardly need to say that again and again. I've said this several times, that we did not create our breathing apparatus. And as the book of Genesis says, it's the breath of God that is keeping us alive. And that breath, if you begin to pay attention to this, already, first of all, changes in its quality. I can guarantee you would actually notice, if you become seriously interested in it, lungs don't begin the initiative of breathing in or breathing out. It begins from much lower down, below the navel. And breathing out will take much longer than breathing in. Many changes take place, and generally they say, according to the medical people, that human adults breathe 13 to 20 times a minute. It's completely crazy. If you begin to pay attention to your breathing, you will not breathe more than 10 times a minute. Try it. And it changes the whole quality of one's thinking, feeling more than thinking, actually. Very much changes it. So I think to pay more and more attention to how we are breathing in or how we are responding, even generally. In fact, even the way we sit makes a difference. All this is emphasized, and then specifically you're saying what kind of words we use. As you know, until about, I believe it's 1972 or something, all the Catholic church services were in Latin. May have been 70, but approximately that date, or somebody else may know more accurate date here. Then they decided to have them in secular languages everywhere. In Germany, it'll be in German, and here it'll be in English, etc. And many people who had been participating in these services, especially this monastery along the coast here in California, I'm just forgetting the name of that monastery. The people there insisted to go back to Latin because it was making quite a difference in their feeling about the whole thing. So in that particular monastery, they have returned to Latin. But the church in general now, trying to be more secular, I guess, or more democratic. So the services take place in different languages. And in India, for example, a very famous book by Tulsi on Ramayana, whenever he has any of the gods speak, he always uses Sanskrit. Otherwise, it is in medieval Hindi, the whole book. Always the notion is that each language has its own different effect on the body. And particularly, if you seriously practice saying Om, where does the initiative begin is very relevant to have what effect it has on the body. When I say the body, including the feeling and the mind, I don't simply mean physically. So I think the whole idea is very important, actually, to begin to pay more and more attention what words we end up using, how we use them, how we respond to other people, what we listen to. All this is relevant because everything is affecting us at a very deep, much deeper level than we think. which is why it's not only a question of something gets said in language can written down. I have occasionally even said, for example, I felt this actually even with Krishnamurti also, but even more so with my teacher, Jean de Salzman. I had heard them so many times I could practically complete their sentence. But why do I still go there? Because it's not only the question of the words they're using, it's the whole emanation of the energy or the vibration that is coming from them. Why does it come? Again, because this is really, we don't need to get stuck on words here because words are required, but anybody could use the I am God. Suppose I said the same words as Christ said, the Father and I are one. That doesn't make it true. Expression of truth is not the truth. This is one of the difficulty in the academic world. The expressions are what we get engaged with, you see, and arguing about this or that. What is the expression? Expression of truth is not the truth.
Is there any reason you didn't use the word pantheism or panentheism in talking about the East?
What do you want to convey?
I hear the critics of the East, some of the evangelical Christians, saying, well, it's pantheism.
Or polytheism is the thing. Yeah, I think maybe I will actually speak about this next time. Since you raised the question now, maybe let me say something now. You look at the Jewish Shema, from where we get the so-called monotheism. How does it begin? Hear, O Israel, our Lord is one. So monotheism results from our Lord is one. Monotheism always becomes my theism. Who would God? In India, the emphasis is not on monotheism, it is on monism, which is to say, God isn't separate something from me, it's just one. On the other hand, within each one of us and in the others, there are many levels. So the various, what you might call angels, or in India it will be called devas, they are not out there any more than God is out there. So therefore, one can, at any given time, regard something coming from a deeper or higher. In India, we would say deeper, you might say higher, or let's say a subtler level. That would be, one could bow to this. One could therefore regard this as helpful divinity, because they are all parts of divinity, but at different levels. So what gets called polytheism is really to say that there are many different levels within each one of us, as well as outside us in the universe. But deep down, it's monism, which is the heart of the whole of the Indian tradition, rather than monotheism, which always becomes my theism. In fact, this might, if you are interested, Octavio Paz, who got a Nobel Prize in Literature, he makes this remark about monotheism, that it has done more harm than almost anything else in the Western culture. All the fights between the Muslims and the Christians have been based on this. My God is different from your God, both of them believing in monotheism. And now they don't even want, when the biblical translations are made into Arabic, somebody was naturally quite rightly translating God as Allah. They said this is not correct. because Allah is different from whatever you are calling God. So you see the problem that arises. But look at the Jewish Shema, which actually from where the whole monotheism comes. Our Lord is the one God. This is how it begins. Okay? Some clarity? Anybody else wishes to bring something?
You know, you say that the stick has two ends. I love that. I was just thinking of, you're saying that the Western tradition thinks of God as being masculine because being so active, an initiator. But yet, in the Christian tradition, you have Paul saying, be still and know that I am God. Or
It's not from Paul, it's one of the Psalms. Psalm 38, if you're interested.
Pardon me?
It's one of the Psalms.
Yeah, oh, it's a psalm, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Or somewhere else in the Bible, I don't know where, but something about stand still and see the battle is not yours but God, or something like that. You know, there is that element of stillness and listening that's honored in that tradition.
Yeah. But even there, you see, the suggestion is that the actual action will be taken from Him, from God. But certainly, very strong call. You're quite right to emphasize that. Call is to be still. But you won't see that very much emphasized in the church. Actually, 2 of the Psalms mention this, not only 1.
Well, it seems to me today there's so much static, so much pulling our attention away, and so much racket within the world that stillness is very challenging to achieve.
Actually, this is in fact very much the call. As you probably know, this very first substantial sutra in the Yoga Sutras, which is actually the second sutra in the first chapter, stopping all the movements of the mind. Because always the strong call is that our mind is just associatively connecting one thing with the other. That there are many levels of reality subtler than the mind. This is, in fact, I often say this is the very meaning of the word spiritual. If something is spiritual, it is subtler than the mind. And therefore, quieting of the mind is the fundamental requirement. Precisely what you just quoted also, stillness of the mind is another way of saying it. But if you actually try it, you will see it's not so easy. The mind actually belongs to the opposing team. But I think actually more and more my impression is it's like a dog which is trying to protect the house, and so it keeps barking. But if the master is at home, then it stops barking. If you are actually connected with something a little subtler, when I say the master at home, then the mind won't continue barking. But it is trying, so there is no need to be against the mind either. It is trying to help, actually. But I think I quoted the other day, a great Chinese classic actually says, when the lion is departed from the mountain, the monkey becomes the king. So in general, we are not connected with our real self, if you like, or the element of divinity that has created us. So the lion is departed from the mountain, so the monkey has become the king. The mind carries on. Let's take a moment to just quiet and then we'll stop.